ACHP podcast. I'm your host, Luke Nichter. May is National Historic Preservation Month, and the theme this year is People Saving Places. That couldn't be more true for our guest today, Lucha Martinez de Luna, the director of the Chicano, Chicanx Murals of Colorado project. She's on a mission to preserve these murals as a key component of Colorado's visual heritage. First, Lucha, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Just as a quick personal aside, I became familiar with murals and their role in preserving culture, heritage, and history maybe 15 years ago when I first moved to Texas. And I think the first murals I saw might have been South Texas, maybe Laredo, and I really didn't know what they were. And seeing much more frequently here now in Southern California, where there's preservation stories, it seems like almost weekly, whether it be in Los Angeles or Santa Ana or Anaheim. So I'm seeing much more of this material now. So I've been wanting to do an interview and have a conversation like this for a very long time. But let's start with the background. So what is your personal background that you bring to the subject?
Well, I'm actually an archaeologist, and so for many years, I didn't necessarily delve into historical preservation at all. This was entirely based on my own personal experiences. My family were, my parents were very much full-time activists during the civil rights movement. And we essentially kind of migrated from place to place depending on what area they were trying to support. And my father was also a civil rights movement. He was an artist who worked with Cesar Chavez in Delano, California, and Reyes Lopez Tejerina in New Mexico with the land rights movement, and of course in Denver with the movement happening there. So we moved around quite frequently. And then my father became very interested in muralism, and he, when he was actually 19, hitchhiked to Mexico to have the opportunity to work with David Alfaro Siqueiros in Mexico, who was working on a very large project there. And based on that experience and that opportunity that he had, Siqueiros encouraged him to go back to Denver to start doing murals, and that's exactly what he did. So around the time that I was born is precisely when he started what I was consider the mural movement in Colorado. So I've been very fortunate to I grew up with murals. They've always been a part of my life. I've grown up around art, and I always felt that the community it was essential for them to have that same experience. And I was able to see how they responded to the murals. And that's pretty much, I've just always been very much involved in muralism. Mm-hmm.
Well, you cover your interesting biography and professional background, but as you alluded to with your family, this is also personal for you, because as you say, your father was a muralist. So what element, what importance does that have, in your own work?
Well, what's interesting is especially for my master's, I worked at Chichen Itza. And from that point, Chichen Itza has probably the most, outside of Teotihuacan, a lot of murals there. And that I was just very fascinated. But because once again, this archaeological component of where I've always focused, I didn't really go beyond that. And so this idea of preservation with contemporary murals it just never really dawned on me that there was a potential to save them, because as I mentioned, my father was very much, it became very normal. I hate to say that it was normalized, but it was, where, after 10 or 15 years of having these amazing murals and the community reacting and considering them part of their spaces, they would be whitewashed or erased. And it really felt like that it was just something our community had to accept as normal. So when I really started noticing the erasure of the murals kind of amplifying in the city, I really thought, well, maybe I can use some of my skills as an archaeologist to see how to protect some of these murals. And I started attending historical kind of preservation types of meetings and started asking about murals. And that's when I learned for the first time in Colorado that, especially in Denver, that murals are classified as just paint on a wall. So that blew my mind. It's like, of course, my work in Mexico with all of the Tres Grandes, Diego Rivera, Siqueiros, and Orozco, to consider that Mexico would never consider a mural as paint on a wall. To me, it was very powerful, that strong message in preservation, that they didn't really even consider people of colors, their history, their forms of expression, which is a lot of times through art, as even worthy of classifying as art. So it just kind of spiraled, and I just kind of trying to figure it out as I go along.
Well, I've got to go off script for a moment because you mentioned Chichen Itza. How in the world does that experience? How does that? I mean, if someone hasn't, a viewer hasn't been to that site, it's a must visit. But how did that professional experience there relate to your work now? Because I think for the average viewer, it might not be obvious. How are the two related, would you say?
Well, I started putting into perspective, especially driving through Denver. I have an archaeological project in Mexico where many times during the year I would be traveling back and forth 3 to 4 times a year. And within like a month period, I would come back to Denver, and the erasure is happening so fast in terms of knocking down historical houses, building cookie cutter houses. So driving through these neighborhoods and not remembering what was there 1 month ago was really scary for me. And then of course the murals not being there as well. So as an archaeologist, I thought, okay, so what does this mean 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 500 years from now, when an archaeologist excavates Denver? What are they going to find there? Because a lot of times, unfortunately for archaeologists, we have very few cultural remains to work with in terms of artifacts. We tend to look more at the monumental level because that's what remains. So for a mural, we were fortunate enough, going back to Chichen, where you have these murals that are around 900 AD, where they're still there. And I'm thinking, okay, if they're erasing all of these murals in Denver, that means that there won't be any type of representation of people of color. They won't even know that they lived in these neighborhoods because they're erasing them from the landscape. Same with what they did with the indigenous communities. They've erased them from the landscape. So it's very difficult for an archaeologist to find traces of them, especially if they're also tearing down their homes. So that's kind of, I started thinking, wow, my family, my ancestors, and other families and their ancestors won't be present in the archaeological record 100, 200 years from now.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, that's the connection that I hoped you would make in terms of between Chichen Itza. I mean, sites that I guess for the average person, it's much easier to recognize their importance to not just heritage but world heritage, but both those and more recent murals. We're talking about vehicles for documenting culture. And as we fast forward to the murals in Colorado, kind of bringing us forward in time. What is the history of these sites, of these Latino, Latinx murals in Colorado?
Well, to me, they definitely represent the displacement that has been happening for decades now, actually centuries, especially with my my background and my ancestry with Hispanos, who in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico, that's where my heritage begins. Chicanos are of mixed ancestry, primarily Spanish and indigenous, native to the Southwest and southern Colorado. And so we've been there. My family, we can trace our heritage back to 1598 when the Spaniards came into northern New Mexico. That's how long we've been there. So we're talking about this really deep history from when it was the Spanish Empire to Mexico and then to the United States. So you have there's actually, we can trace one generation that lived through that period where it switched 3 times. So that's what these murals do, is they describe that deep history, and they also put, it essentially is a historical textbook where, okay, this is how you ended up in this neighborhood in Denver. They trace our migration, but not, it's literally not, it could be 100 miles of a migration from southern Colorado, northern New Mexico to Denver, or to Brighton or Greeley to work in the fields, the agricultural fields, to work in the industrial industry. But the murals trace all of that history, the landscapes, the indigenous communities that lived in the areas that we call home, and also the Hispanos that lived there in 1598. So that's what these murals are doing. They're anchoring us in our space.
I feel like you've led us right to the next obvious question then. So how did you get involved with the effort to preserve these murals? What do those steps look like? Because of course there could be other viewers or listeners right now who themselves are at that stage of getting more involved to preserve those. So for you, what did that look like?
Well, initially it was just me archiving the murals, documenting the murals, starting to do interviews with muralists, because they are getting older, and then after that, it was me attending the preservation meetings. I was invited to do a presentation about murals for the very first time at the Denver Art Museum, where I started kind of reconnecting. And actually there is when it was a mural symposium, and for the first time I was hearing all these other types of projects, as you mentioned, Los Angeles, what they were doing there, and networking. And of course, we founded the Mural Project in 2018, which kind of accelerated things a little bit. But it was really initially just exploring, and then I think what changed everything was in 2020, to be honest, because before that, there wasn't too much interest when I would try and approach cultural institutions about, hey, what could we do to try and stop destroying these murals? But after 2020, things accelerated a little bit, and I was starting to get a lot of support from other organizations. The one that's been wonderful is Historic Denver, because at the same time that I was looking into preserving murals, CMCP, at the same time we were trying to designate a cultural historic district where the mural activity began. So it kind of overlapped with each other. So primarily the focus has been on building this awareness of, when you destroy a mural, it means so much to the community, and it's devastating to them when they do that, because once again, it's a form of cultural erasure.
You mentioned the surge of interest has come about, more recently in the last few years. It's interesting. This podcast, normally we speak to a broad cross section of people involved in preservation in some way or the other, and it's obviously a big community with lots of different people and skill sets. But your efforts were helped along recently by the National Trust for Historic Preservation's listing of Colorado's Chicano murals on its 2022 11 Most Endangered Historic Places list. We don't often deal in hard news on this podcast. We care more about personal stories. But here's a case of very timely recognition of your work. So what does this mean for your organization?
Oh, it's huge. I mean, it's a very big step for us that I honestly, when I submitted it, it was kind of just like, I'll see what happens type of thing. I was really hoping for the best, but I, um, I didn't really have too much hope that they would. I don't know. It seemed like a long shot. It really did. And when they told us about it, I just knew that this was going to elevate Colorado muralism, because that's also been another issue. Is LA has other big cities have very much been recognized for their muralism, but for some reason Colorado is kind of always left out of that narrative. And so more than one thing is happening here in terms of preservation. It's also building awareness of the mural activity in Colorado. So it's kind of twofold. But for me, I feel like it's going to really, really make the community feel like, we do matter, that this is important, and they've always known it's important, but now other people are recognizing the importance of these murals. So I think it will really help us in protecting them. Mhm.
As I said earlier, until I first experienced murals in South Texas and Southern California, I guess I was like a lot of Americans who might not have had exposure or understood the importance of these. You referred to them as, for some people, it was just paint on a wall. Or maybe for others who really are ignorant or don't understand, it might have been equated with graffiti, on walls. So for those out there, and there are probably millions of Americans who may not live in a community where they understand the importance of these, why, you've already suggested the answer to the question, but I'll ask it anyways. Why is it important to preserve these murals in as many communities as we can?
Well, I also, when I explain the murals, we're not just talking about a depiction of Chicano history, Hispano history, Latino history. We are talking about the history of the United States. So the murals are not just representing our history, the Chicano history. They're very representative of the diversity of this country. And really showing how we are all interrelated, that we are all linked together. And I think they're a testimony of really how beautiful this country is in terms of their diversity. So I really emphasize that they also talk about the importance of protecting our environment, in indigenous lifeways, and really building a bridge between the past, present, and future for this country. Mhm.
So interesting and well said. We didn't get into kind of the technical challenges of preserving these murals, but surely there are some in terms of these are threatened by climate change. They're threatened by just natural, the environment and being outdoors. Again, going off script for just a moment, but can you describe a little bit kind of the challenges that are involved to preserving these murals?
Well, I would say the actual physical challenges of preserving a mural is not as complex as the fact that many of these murals were created in redline communities, which means that when redlining was, even in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, that means that people of color did not have access to mortgages and to get loans. And so a lot of these murals were created on buildings that they did not own. So that is what's very complicated. And as I mentioned before, the displacement that's going on right now, the gentrification, we are losing any type of ownership that we have to these neighborhoods. And that also, it applies to the building, it applies to the neighborhoods. So we have, in preservation, if you don't own a building, it's very difficult to protect it in terms of giving it landmark status. So that's what's very complicated. We were very careful in how we listed this with the National Trust, because we're still negotiating with a lot of building owners, just hoping that they see the importance of these murals and want to help us to protect them. So that's the biggest obstacle we have right now, is the ownership. It's very easy in preservation, I think, to work with buildings, but with just a mural on a wall is something completely different. But it's going to challenge preservation because people of color don't fit into that box of preservation, that Western lens of preservation. So now it's a challenge for the country and for the preservation community to really look outside of the box and look for new strategies in preservation.
And I wonder if you would agree, but here what we're talking about too is protecting not just the content of the mural, but obviously the neighborhood in which it was created and exists. I mean, the two, it's not as though we could somehow move these murals to a national museum of the mural. The fact is that they're important because of the community they're located.
Yeah, absolutely. The statement they're making, as you mentioned, it's not just the content, it's also where they're standing, where there was a community here once that had picnics in front of this mural, that had dances in front of the mural, live bands. And, one story that my father always talks about is when one of his murals that he created, there was one time that when he walked up to the mural, for some reason, I think he was looking at doing a little bit of restoration work. There was a man standing there with he was drinking a cup of coffee, and they just started kind of talking, and he asked him, "Do you come here frequently?" And he's like, "I wake up every morning with my cup of coffee and come to this mural." And he asked him why, and he's like, "Well, this mural gives me energy. This is how I start my day. I need that energy from this mural." And so to me, my experiences in studying ancient cultures, that a lot of murals were seen as portals into another world, into another space, another time. And so I often use that same analogy for these murals. They are portals for our community, and they give us energy. They instill in us a sense of pride in who we are, and a form of celebrating our identity, especially at a time when the rest of society was telling us that we don't matter, that we're not important, that we don't have a voice in this space. Mm-hmm.
Well, I always like to end these podcasts with a kind of call for action. So talk a little bit about those listening or viewing. What can they do to learn more? What can they do to get involved? And what can they ultimately do to help?
Well, we do have on our website, there is a form that we're asking communities in Colorado to we want to hear back from them. I mean, we don't know where all the murals are, and most likely we're probably missing some. So we're asking the community can contribute by filling out this form that really tells us more of a narrative of their community and which murals matter to them, which murals they see as historical or legacy murals. And also, I think this is a call to action for other cities in the country to really start thinking about what would they like to see preserved in their communities. And now that we are really in part of this conversation that we've never been, I think, invited to in terms of what can we preserve in your community, I think it is a call to action for all communities to really think about what matters to them. What do we need to preserve for future generations?
Sure sounds like, given the recognition you received already, that you've got as you begin to inventory these sites nationwide, that you've got the makings of a potential really great National Endowment for the Humanities grant or something, a multi-year project that will really nationalize this effort and give the recognition that you deserve. So definitely, I would be, if you're not already, be thinking about how to capitalize on the great attention that you've gotten already.
Yeah, and also too, we're involved in several private projects right now where we've always known that these murals really help to learn history. And we are noticing that students from elementary all the way to high school and college, they really enjoy going into these spaces and learning history that way, where they're not learning the same narrative, reading the same textbooks. It's like they're going into the community and learning about the community, but also the history of our nation. And I think that is very important too. Also, another way of celebrating these murals is really, they really speak to more than just one community.
I think that's a great way to sum it up. So let me just say again, thank you, Lucia, for joining us, and to our viewers. Follow the ACHP social media channels to keep up with all of our National Historic Preservation Month activities. Thank you for joining us. I'm Luke Nichter, and this is Preservation Perspectives.